In this module, we consider what is arguably the dominant civilizational ideal in our own society, the drive to transcend finitude by means of scientific, technological, and economic progress. We call this ideal technocratic secularism, and while it often understands itself as indifferent to or as opposed to religion, from the vantage point of a functional definition of religion, it does everything that religion does. It provides meaning and direction for human beings and solidarity for human societies. Indeed, it would not be too much to say that whatever people in our society believe, the way they act is determined by this technocratic ideal. Where does this technocratic secular ideal come from? Clearly, if we are to believe Weber, Calvinism was at least a form of transition from the axial ideals generally, and Christianity in particular, to something like a technocratic secularism. For Calvin, God takes care of salvation. Our job is to do his will in this world using the capacities he gave us in order to be fruitful and multiply, an injunction which has generally been interpreted as a call to productivity. This said, something more was clearly necessary for us to arrive at technocratic secularism, and the something more was the scientific revolution. Science as a distinctive enterprise based on empirical observation and systematic rational analysis of the phenomenal world was one of the innovations of the axial age. It was, more specifically, an integral part of the process we have called religious rationalization. But axial age science and the medieval science which developed out of it was teleological in nature. It sought to explain the world in terms of its purpose, and it found its completion in metaphysics and theology. To the extent that it contributed to technological development, it did so by showing us how to tap into existing dynamics of growth and development and encourage them. This is the basis of medieval sciences, such as alchemy. Teleological physics ultimately ran into serious scientific problems. This is because it was unable to advance a unified theory of motion. How does one explain teleologically a decaying corpse or a thrown javelin? These processes did not seem in any sense ordered to the perfection of the things in question. This led to a distinction being made in teleological physics between natural and violent motion, and to a distinction between the celestial realm, where all motion is natural or teleological, and the sublunar or earthly realm, where both kinds of change occur. Second, teleological science had considerable difficulty coming to terms with the growing evidence that even the heavens were not ordered in the perfect manner required by teleological theory. This was a problem long before Copernicus and Kepler. There were sharp differences between Aristotle's cosmology, for example, and the formal mathematical models of his near contemporary Eudoxus. Refinement of these models by Ptolemy and others already involved a departure from the perfect spherical motion which was central to Aristotle's system, long before Copernicus opted for heliocentrism or Kepler displaced the circle with the ellipse. The scientific revolution of the 17th century resolved these problems by abandoning teleological explanation in favor of a focus on formal mathematical description. Thus, the whole history of mathematical physics, beginning with the special theories of Galileo and Kepler, up through the first unification by Newton, and each of the successive generalizations and unifications of modern physics, Hamiltonian dynamics, Maxwell's equations, relativity, quantum mechanics, and most recently quantum cosmology. Modern science is fundamentally just a system of equations. The reasons for this choice against teleology were as much political and theological as scientific. Teleological physics presented specific problems for the doctrines of divine sovereignty, which emerged as a reflex of the strong state structures which began to develop with the Crusades. Indeed, already in 1270 and 1277, Stephen Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, condemned a number of Averroist hypotheses, including the eternity of the universe and the impossibility of moving the universe in a straight line, on the grounds that they conflicted with the emerging idea of divine sovereignty. This effectively forced physics to abandon teleology in favor of mathematical formalization. What this suggests, of course, is the emergence of modern science and mathematical physics far from representing a turn away from the sacred to the secular, was, at least to begin with, a rejection of one theology in favor of another. Specifically, it was a rejection of an Aristotelian theology which regarded God as a teleological attractor and spiritualization as an immanent property of matter itself, for an Augustinian theology which regarded God as an absolute sovereign and matter as inert and dependent. And this remained explicitly the case up through the 18th century. Early modern scientists like Newton and his colleagues took for granted that the wonderful order they were describing had a divine author in terms of whom alone its beauty and harmony could be adequately explained. Indeed, they regarded the motion they described as, in effect, divine action, and their science is no less sacred than the old Aristotelian physics. Indeed, mathematical physics actually contributed a way of measuring the efficiency of our contribution to God's work in the world. The equations of Newtonian physics include one for work, W equals Fs, where W is work, F is force, and S is distance. This allows us to measure the quantity of work done per unit of time, per unit of energy, or per unit of money. The more work we do, the more efficiently, the better we carry out God's work in the world. In this sense, Weber was quite correct that Protestantism and capitalism, and indeed industrial production in general, are intimately bound up with each other. It was rather the theory of evolution by means of random variation and natural selection which led to the tension between religion and science that we now take for granted. What this theory does is to explain how complex organization, life, and intelligence can emerge spontaneously without an intelligent designer. This is not, to be sure, a problem for religion in general. It does not even create problems for theism in general if we understand by God the power of being as such, in which everything in the universe participates. Indeed, science still points either to God as the power of being as such, which can explain why there is something rather than nothing, or to the web of interdependent origination suggested by Buddhism, which defines an alternative, non-theistic spirituality. But a world governed by modern science no longer needs God as a source of order. It no longer needs a divine sovereign. That role instead is taken up by humanity, understood above all as homo faber, as the maker of things. Scientific, technological, and economic progress are no longer read as a response to God's command to be fruitful and multiply, but rather as a way to push back the limits of finitude and contingency. Thus the origin of technocratic secularism. There are, to be sure, different variants of this ideal. The dominant scientific consensus tends to read the results of modern science in a rather pessimistic way. The dominant cosmological models, for example, suggest that in the long run the universe will just continue to expand until everything is so far apart that no new stars can form. As the existing stars burn out, the universe will become cold and barren. The human struggle to transcend finitude by means of science, technology, and economic progress is ultimately doomed. The most radical expression of this consensus is the new atheism, represented here by its four horsemen: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. At the other end of the spectrum lies the omega point theory advanced by Tulane University physicist Frank Tipler, which argues that humanity can re-engineer the entire universe to bring into being a kind of eternal life and, in effect, to build God. In between stand a range of positions, including most forms of transhumanism, which look to technology to help human beings evolve beyond our current limitations and perhaps become immortal, dying only as a result of accidents rather than from disease and old age, while remaining agnostic about the long-term fate of the universe.